Previously, Fang Yuan seized fortune from the merchant caravan and uncovered a deeper path within the flower wine traveler's legacy. Now, with the White Boar Gu in his hands, he steps into the mountain wilderness where hunting hidden maps and ruthless choices will shape his next move. Let us continue with Reverend Insanity, Episode 6. By day, the academy was the same as always. The academy elder was explaining to the students how to choose their second Gu worm, warning them to think carefully and ideally, to choose one that could work in coordination with their vital Gu. All the youths listened very attentively. Only Fang Yuan was sprawled over the desk, fast asleep. Because the night before he had just gone back to the rock crevice and had even cultivated until nearly dawn. The academy elder saw it but only frowned and let it pass. Ever since the clan leader had spoken to him privately, he had begun ignoring Fang Yuan, no longer deliberately suppressing him. And in the eyes of the other students, Fang Yuan had now become a very special kind of existence. Everyone knew that he already had a second Gu worm, the liquor worm. Some admired him, some envied him, and some could only sigh inwardly that they did not have luck like his. Even Chi Cheng could not help feeling stung. Fang Zheng, on the other hand, was in far better spirits. With only one thought left in his heart, he absolutely had to surpass his elder brother. But that night, Fang Yuan once again slipped into the cave within the rock crevice. This time, he did not go empty-handed. In his hand was a wild rabbit he had caught in the mountains. Around the rabbit's neck was tied a small bell, so that the moment it ran, it would let out a ringing sound. The air in the cave was now completely different from the night before. The stifling atmosphere had completely vanished. The entrance to the tunnel was still open. Inside, everything was utterly silent without a single sound. But Fang Yuan did not hurry to enter. The first thing he did was still to lower his head and inspect the stone dust he had sprinkled down yesterday. The dust at the entrance to the tunnel was still intact. The dust at the entrance of the rock crevice also showed no strange traces besides his own footprints. That meant that while he had been away, nothing had crawled out from inside the cave, and no one else had come searching their way here. Only after confirming that did he begin the next step. Fang Yuan pulled down all the dry vines from the stone wall, sat down right there, and twisted them together by hand into a long grass rope, tying one end around the rabbit's hind leg. This was not something an ordinary Gu master would do, but Fang Yuan was different. In his previous life, there had been times when he was so destitute that he could not even feed his Gu worms, had no primeval essence, had nothing at all in hand, and lived no differently from immortals. It was during those bitter months that he had learned all kinds of trivial survival skills, braiding grass ropes, weaving straw sandals, trading them for a few fragments of primeval stones just to keep breathing. So now, as his hands began braiding again, memories from long ago quietly resurfaced. In the dim red light of the cave, the face of that youth suddenly carried something very strange, both young and yet worn by age. The bell at the rabbit's neck gave a faint ring. The sound of grass rope twisting together continued, and the whole cave was so silent that even time itself seemed to slow. Half a watch later, the rope was finally done. Fang Yuan released the rabbit. The wild rabbit dashed straight into the tunnel in panic. The bell around its neck rang continuously, the sound quickly echoing deep inside until it vanished from Fang Yuan's sight. The grass rope in Fang Yuan's hand was also dragged along little by little. A moment later, the rope suddenly stopped moving. Fang Yuan did not jump to any conclusion, because the rabbit might have reached the end of the tunnel, or it might already have died in a trap, or it might simply be standing still somewhere. So he began pulling the rope back. The moment the rope tightened, a resisting force immediately came from the other end. The rabbit, startled by the sudden tug, panicked and bolted farther inward again. He repeated this several times. In the end, the rope only alternated between slack and taut, and could no longer be pulled farther away. Fang Yuan guessed that the rabbit had probably reached the end of the tunnel or had gotten stuck somewhere. The way to find out the real answer was very simple. He began pulling hard. The rabbit on the other end struggled violently, but how could its strength compare to his? Though the grass rope had only been hastily braided from dry vines, The material had come from withered wine pouch flower gu and big stomach grass gu, which was still far tougher and more flexible than ordinary grass. In the end, the rabbit was dragged back out by him. Fang Yuan immediately inspected its whole body. There were no wounds, no cuts, no punctures, no signs of having triggered a trap. Only then did he let out a quiet breath. At the very least, this stretch of tunnel could for the moment be considered safe. Now that he had learned what he needed, the rabbit no longer had any value. Fang Yuan crushed it to death and tossed the corpse aside. He could not release it. Animals also had memories if he let this rabbit go. And it later accidentally led someone else here the way the liquor worm once had. Then the entire secret of this place would become a disaster. Only after that did he truly step into the tunnel. But even now, he did not relax in the slightest. Because a wild rabbit might fail to trigger traps that only targeted humans, so every step he took was still extremely cautious. Every step was probing, every step was guarded. The tunnel was straight, slanting gradually downward into the earth, and the farther in he went, the wider it became. At first, when entering, he still had to bow and stoop. Only after going another 50 paces was he finally able to stand upright. Going deeper still, he could already stretch both arms out to the sides. The entire passage was only about 300 paces long, but at Fang Yuan's pace, it still took him a full watch to probe his way to the very end. By the time he arrived, his whole body was drenched in sweat. Not having a gu worm specialized for probing really was troublesome. He wiped away the sweat, then raised his head and looked ahead, then he stopped short. Because the end of the tunnel was not a secret chamber, not a gu worm, and not any kind of opportunity. It was a gigantic boulder. Its outer surface was smooth and bulged toward him, perfectly round like Gu Fu's belly. That very stone blocked off the entire way ahead. Other than it, there was nothing else around. Fang Yuan stood looking at it for a very long time. He began thinking of the worst possibility, perhaps back in those days. The flower wine traveler had hurriedly opened this path before he died. But after hundreds of years passed with no one repairing it, one section of the tunnel inside the mountain had finally collapsed and blocked the way. If that were really the case, then the inheritance he had worked so hard to find might now be buried shut right before his eyes. He stepped forward and touched the boulder. Just the part exposed on the outside was already as large as a door. Its thickness inside was surely even more terrifying. Using moonlight gu to grind through a stone wall was still possible. But if he wanted to grind through a massive block like this, it would probably take 1 or 2 years. There were faster methods, of course. Using an iron pry bar, using a shovel, using crude tools to smash it open. But the problem was that doing so would leave far too many traces, and the noise echoing inside the mountain might not be possible to conceal. At that point, if someone else discovered the secret of this place, all the arrangements he had made beforehand would come to nothing. More importantly, his own life would also face real danger. So standing before that boulder, Fang Yuan was not merely looking at an obstacle, he was weighing two things. On one side was the inheritance of the flower wine traveler. On the other was the price he would have to pay if he continued digging deeper, and for Fang Yuan, if the price to be paid exceeded the limit, then even if it were an opportunity right before his eyes, he would be willing to let it go. At last, the day to choose the second gu worm arrived. Early that morning, in front of the Academy Gu chamber, the students had already formed a line long ago. Every one of them showed clear excitement. After all, this was a very important step for every new gu master. And standing at the head of the line was still Fang Yuan. Because he was the first to enter middle stage, he naturally had the right to choose first. The doors of the gu chamber opened, Fang Yuan stepped in alone. The room was not large, but all 4 walls were carved with large and small square compartments. In each compartment were stone basins, jade plates, ceramic jars, within which all kinds of rank 1 gu worms were being raised. Just maintaining this group of gu already burned through more than 1,000 primeval stones per day for the academy. Fang Yuan's gaze swept through the room once. To the youths who had first entered, this place had once been a treasure ground. But to him, it was only passable. The first time he stepped in here, his goal had been very clear. The moment he entered, he had chosen Moonlight Gu. This time was different. He had several possible choices in mind. Unfortunately, the truly good options were not likely to appear in a place like the Academy Gu chamber. He moved along the wall and began examining them one by one. First, there was a whole row of bronze skin Gu, stone skin Gu, and then iron skin Gu. These were all defensive Gu worms, extremely suitable for close combat Gu masters. Once activated, the body would become tougher and much more resistant to blows. An ordinary person would likely have been tempted. But Fang Yuan only passed them by. Things like that were not yet enough to catch his eye. He still held onto a little hope. If there had been Jade Skin Gu here, then choosing it this time would not have been bad. After all, Jade Skin Gu was the rarest of the Skin Gu line, extremely valuable, almost on the same level as the Liquor Worm. Unfortunately, what he saw next was only a row of Beast Skin Gu. It was not that they could not be used. They just were not good enough. Having gone through one wall, he turned to the second. Here, the most numerous were Heavenly Bull Gu. The first thing to catch his eye was Barbaric Strength Heavenly Bull Gu. This Gu could explosively grant a Gu master the strength of one bull for a short time. It was extremely powerful and also sold very well on the market. But it had two very obvious flaws. First, it consumed too much primeval essence. Second, the aftereffects were serious. Using it too often could easily strain muscles and even injure tendons and bones. With Fang Yuan's current body, it was simply unsuitable. He continued looking, then stopped before another one. Enduring Yellow Heavenly Bull Gu. This one did not give explosive strength like Barbaric Strength Heavenly Bull Gu. What it gave was endurance, once activated. The rate at which physical strength was consumed would slow greatly. And it could last for an entire quarter of an hour with no aftereffects. Among rank 1 Gu worms, its value is also very high, almost equal to Moonlight Gu, only one step below the Liquor Worm. If it were someone else, perhaps they would have chosen it immediately. But Fang Yuan only looked at it for a moment, then passed it by. It was not that the Gu worm was poor. It was that it did not fit the path he wanted to walk. He moved on to the third wall. This time, what appeared before him was a different line of Gu, the Strength Gu line. The cheapest among them was Powder Strength Gu, whose effect was extremely peculiar, used only to make a person fatter. Because of that, the Gu chamber had only a few of them, and nearly no one paid attention. The most common by far was Flower Strength Gu, a type that could increase strength for a short period. Quite similar to Barbaric Strength Heavenly Bull Gu, but gentler, longer-lasting, and much cheaper. This was the truly popular Gu worm, good and affordable, so it sold very well. But what drew Fang Yuan's attention most were two other names: Black Boar Gu and White Boar Gu. Those were the truly good goods. Because those two Gu did not simply grant temporary strength, but could fundamentally transform a Gu master's body, causing physical power to grow little by little over time. Once that strength had been trained into the body, then even if the Gu worm later died, that strength would still belong to the Gu master. Because of this, the prices of Black Boar Gu and White Boar Gu were even higher than the Liquor Worm. The moment they appeared on the market, people fought to buy them all. Unfortunately, Fang Yuan could only think so and no more. How could a place like the Academy Gu chamber possibly store Gu worms that rare? After going through the whole chamber, he understood it very clearly. There was nothing here that he truly wanted. So there was no need to continue wasting time. At last, in a corner of the wall, he took away a little light Gu. This Gu was shaped like a 5-pointed star, very small, and was mainly used to support Moonlight Gu. It was a rather familiar auxiliary Gu worm. To put it plainly, this was only a transitional choice. It was not perfect, but at least it still fit his current direction of development. When Fang Yuan finally strolled back out, the students waiting outside had already begun to grow impatient. Some were curious what he had chosen. Some were jealous that he already had the Liquor Worm and now was taking yet another Gu. Some sneered, thinking that with his current circumstances, keeping 3 Gu worms might not actually be a good thing. But Fang Yuan did not care. He only held the little light Gu and quietly walked out, as calm as if nothing at all had happened. After him, the second to rush inside was Gu Yue Chen, his goal was extremely clear. The moment he entered, he searched straight for the one and only enduring yellow heavenly bull Gu in the chamber. When he saw that it was still there, he was almost overjoyed and immediately chose it. The third was Fang Zheng. Compared to his elder brother, his choice was much more practical. He already had Moonlight Gu for offense, so what he lacked was defense. After weighing things for a while, he ultimately chose Bronze Skin Gu. Not an especially dazzling choice, but a very solid one. The fourth to enter was Gu Yue Cheng. He was thinking in a completely different direction. In his mind, the ideal form of battle was that he could hit others, while others could not touch him. So after choosing for a while, he finally decided on whirling Longhorn Cricket Gu, clearly intending to develop toward evasion and mobility. That night, in a secluded corner of the courtyard inside Gu Yu Mountain Village, clan leader Gu Yu Bo once again summoned Fang Zheng privately. Under the shadow of the scholar tree, moonlight fell silently. The wind blew through the canopy, and the shadows of the branches swayed. Fang Zheng stood straight before the clan leader, so tense that he nearly did not dare breathe too hard. Gu Yu Bo did not waste words. He asked at once what Fang Zheng had chosen as his second Gu today. Bronze Skin Gu, Fang Zheng answered very quickly. After hearing this, the clan leader nodded and said something that surprised him. It was a very good choice. At first, Fang Zheng thought this was only some perfunctory encouragement, but unexpectedly, Gu Yu Bo began analyzing it in detail. In his eyes, choosing a Gu worm was never a simple matter. Many times, the Gu a person chose also revealed that person's character. Fang Zheng had chosen Bronze Skin Gu, making defense his main focus, and pairing it with Moonlight Gu to form one offensive and one defensive element. That showed he was an upright person, one who acted with measure and followed a steady path. One offense and one defense, one yin and one yang, that was a truly complete balance. Then the clan leader mentioned the other two. Mo Bei had chosen enduring yellow heavenly bull Gu. That type was inclined toward endurance and drawn-out battle, showing that Mo Bei was the kind of person who was stubborn, persistent, and very difficult to wear down. As for Kai Cheng, he had chosen whirling Longhorn Cricket Gu. That thing leaned toward dodging and agility, proving that he was clever, knew how to evade and disliked direct collision. But on the other hand, it also revealed a certain softness in his character. By the time he heard this, Fang Zheng was almost stunned. He had never expected that one could see so much just from the choice of a Gu worm. In his eyes, the image of the clan leader rose another level. But then, almost by instinct, he asked about another person, Fang Yuan. When he heard this, Gu Yu Bo only smiled faintly. He said that Fang Yuan had chosen Little Light Gu. That was an auxiliary Gu for Moonlight Gu, one that made the Moonblade stronger. And such a choice in the clan leader's eyes showed that Fang Yuan's temperament was very intense, very warlike, and very likely to go to extremes. After hearing this, Fang Zheng only answered quietly that his elder brother indeed did seem to be like that. On the surface, this conversation looked only like advice from an elder. But in truth, Gu Yu Bo was quietly observing very carefully inside. His deliberate analysis of Mo Bei and Kai Cheng for Fang Zheng was precisely to help him clearly see these two rivals. Because in the clan leader's eyes, with great aptitude, Fang Zheng ought to stand at the top of this generation. He wanted him to maintain that leading position, wanted him step by step to suppress those of the same generation. But he would never say that openly. Because he was the clan leader. Every word and every action of his was tied to the greater picture. If he directly incited Fang Zheng to oppose someone, then once such words spread, the matter could be interpreted as factional infighting within the clan. At best, hearts would waver. At worst, real internal struggle would erupt. So he could only guide by implication. He wanted Fang Zheng to understand it on his own. Because what Gu Yu Bo wanted to cultivate was not a subordinate good at fighting and killing, but someone who could become the clan's future leader. Unfortunately, Fang Zheng still had not truly grasped that deeper meaning. The clan leader had only just finished analyzing two of his rivals, and Fang Zheng had already turned back to ask about Fang Yuan. In Gu Yu Bo's eyes, that alone already said a great deal. It showed that Fang Yuan's shadow still loomed far too large in Fang Zheng's heart. That psychologically he was still being weighed down by that elder brother. and that he still had not truly stood firm on his own. Even the clan leader could not help but sigh inwardly. If only Fang Zheng had greater aptitude together with Fang Yuan's mind and political sensitivity, that would truly have been best. Unfortunately, although Fang Yuan was far smarter than the youths of his generation, he possessed only grade C aptitude. But Gu Yue did not reveal any of those thoughts outwardly. He only smiled, then slowly took out another Gu worm from inside his robe. The moment Fang Zheng saw it, his eyes lit up. Jade Skin Gu. Compared with Bronze Skin Gu, this thing was clearly one level higher. It consumed less primeval essence, while its defensive power was also somewhat stronger. In other words, this was a reward that any student would want. Gu Yue looked at him and asked very directly, "Do you want it?" Fang Zheng nearly could not control himself. He stammered out that of course he wanted it. But the clan leader immediately changed his tone. He said clearly that as clan leader, he had to be fair and impartial. He could not hand this thing over to him for no reason. If Fang Zheng wanted it, he had to exchange it for one condition. At once Fang Zheng's nerves tightened. And that condition was that he had to become the first person of this class to break through to rank 2. Not only that, this Jade Skin Gu was being handed over in advance, as a reward staked upon Fang Zheng's future. When he heard that requirement, Fang Zheng quite clearly hesitated. Because he had only just stepped into rank 1 middle stage. From middle stage to upper stage, then to peak, and only then to rank 2, that distance was not short at all. But at the exact moment he hesitated, Gu Yue deliberately did something. He pretended to withdraw the Jade Skin Gu. That single action immediately struck straight at Fang Zheng's pride. His blood ran hot and he immediately blurted out his promise. He wanted that Gu worm and he would defeat everyone, becoming the first person to break through to rank 2. Only after hearing that did the clan leader smile and place the Jade Skin Gu into his hand. On the surface, it looked like a reward. But in truth, it was also a powerful push. Because in Gu Yue's eyes, Fang Zheng's greatest danger was not his talent, but the inferiority complex still buried deep inside him. And the best way to shatter that inferiority was not comfort, but to give him a real victory. If he could become the first to enter rank 2, then that would be the first time he truly confirmed himself. And also the most important step in building the confidence of someone fit to stand at the top. At the same time elsewhere, Fang Yuan entered the secret tunnel once again. This time he brought no pickaxe, no shovel, and no excavation tools of any kind. Because the night before, when leaving this place, he had already begun to feel that something was not right. That boulder blocking the road was too round, too smooth, too much like something intentionally made by human hands. And if it was intentional, then it was not a chance obstacle, it was a checkpoint. Thinking this, he crouched down and examined it more closely. Very quickly, he found something unusual beneath the boulder. A patch of earth darker than the surroundings. It was not obvious at a glance, but when he touched it, he immediately realized the spot was damp. Inside a tunnel this dry, for a patch of damp soil to appear directly beneath the rock blocking the way was already in itself a very clear signal. Fang Yuan squatted down and began digging by hand. The earth here was not firm like the surroundings, but soft and loose, carrying a trace of moisture. The deeper he dug, the more he felt he was getting closer to what he wanted. Then suddenly, a very strange fragrance drifted up. Not strong, not pungent, but elegant, refined, barely there. The moment he smelled it, Fang Yuan almost immediately guessed the answer. His hands sped up at once. Not long after, a streak of gold began to appear beneath the damp soil. He continued digging, carefully bit by bit, until the entire thing buried beneath the ground gradually emerged. It was a flower bud of dark gold, as large as a millstone, its surface smooth, mysterious, and carrying an oddly lofty air. The moment he saw it, Fang Yuan immediately confirmed it, Earth Treasury Flower Gu. Only then did he truly let out a breath, because this thing was the real key to going forward. He did not hurriedly break it open at once. First he rested a bit, wiped his hands clean, and only then began slowly peeling away its petals one by one. Each dark gold petal that was stripped away vanished at once into the air, like snowflakes meeting heat and dissolving into nothing. The deeper he peeled, the thinner the petals became, going from as thick as silk to as thin as paper, at last at the center of the bud. Only a fist-sized, translucent flower core remained, filled with golden liquid. And within that liquid, a Gu worm was sleeping. Fang Yuan looked at it carefully. At first he saw only a vague shape. But when he opened the flower cores, the golden liquid slowly flowed away. And the Gu inside revealed itself completely. It was a little ladybug, milk-white all over, round looking both plump and short, with 6 legs tucked beneath its belly and a gleaming shell. The moment he clearly saw its shape, Fang Yuan's eyes flashed. White Boar Gu. At that instant, even he could not hide his joy. Over these past days, the weather had grown hotter and hotter. At noon, the sun poured fire over the entire mountain village. The merchant caravan had long since left, and the inn had become much more desolate. As usual, Fang Yuan entered the dining hall alone. The servant, the moment he saw him, hurried out to greet him, so attentive that he nearly bent in half. But the first thing Fang Yuan asked about was still green bamboo wine. Unfortunately, that wine had already been bought out by the merchant caravan long before. Hearing that, he did not look surprised. He only switched to rice wine, then casually told the innkeeper to brew much more green bamboo wine this year, even saying that he wanted to place an advance order for a full 100 jars. Now that the liquor worm had already been exposed to the open, he no longer needed to hide the fact that he was buying wine. The food was brought up. Fang Yuan ate while looking out the window. There were very few people passing along the road. A few farmers with muddy feet were carrying hoes back after a morning in the fields. 2 children chased each other over a small pinwheel. Then 2 young Gu masters passed by, coldly shoving the mortals aside as though such a thing were completely natural. There was nothing unusual in that scene. But at the exact moment he was watching all of it, Fang Yuan's mind had already sunk inward into his aperture. Inside the primeval sea, his several Gu worms were all clearly present. The liquor worm floated leisurely. Spring-autumn cicada continued sleeping, silent as if it had never existed. And the White Boar Gu circled in the air, its small milk-white body making Fang Yuan's gaze brighten faintly. Because the value of this thing was by no means low. White Boar Gu and Black Boar Gu were originally equally famous, both rare rank 1 Gu worms. Outwardly they looked similar, and their effects were also similar, but their later advancement paths were completely different. Black Boar Gu could be refined upward into Black Mane Gu and then Steel Mane Gu. As for White Boar Gu, if developed along the correct route, it would combine with Jade Skin Gu to become White Jade Gu, and from there continue advancing into Heavenly Canopy Gu. That was what truly made Fang Yuan happy. Not merely because he had picked up a good Gu worm, but because from White Boar Gu he could see the intentions of the flower wine traveler. That giant boulder blocking the road in the cave was very likely the first trial. First, let the inheritor obtain White Boar Gu and gradually increase bodily strength. Only after enough strength had been gained could the inheritor push aside the boulder and continue deeper within. Thinking of this, Fang Yuan had almost already confirmed one matter. This inheritance was not a trap, at least. Judging from the current arrangement, the flower wine traveler truly had wanted to leave an inheritance to someone who came later. Not merely to set up a pit to drag others to death with him. And that fact was more important to Fang Yuan than anything else. Because he knew very clearly what a cultivating Gu master needed most. Not fame, not talent, but resources. To cultivate, one had to have resources. But the clan's resources were limited. If one wanted to obtain them, then one could only compete. Not only compete, but win. But the problem was that Fang Yuan could not go on forever raising his head and fighting openly in the light. He understood his current situation too well. On the surface, it seemed like he had already offended many people. But in truth, no one yet truly regarded him as a threat that had to be uprooted immediately. The reason was very simple. He was still weak and he possessed only grade C aptitude. Precisely because he was weak, he was actually safe for now. Those standing above did not consider it worth their effort to fuss over a mere child like him, at most. The older generation looked at him as a somewhat overbearing youth with a bit of ability and a bit of scheming. But not yet worthy of being smashed to death. In fact, that very weakness was becoming an umbrella over his head. But that umbrella would not exist forever. Once he continued competing for resources, continued becoming stronger, continued revealing his ability. The way others looked at him would also change from contempt to attention, from attention to wariness, and then from wariness into recruitment, suppression, and restraint. When that time came, no matter which side he stood on, he would become a target of the other sides. And once he stepped into that turning wheel, the speed of his development would certainly be dragged down. Fang Yuan saw this rule far too clearly. To join the system meant to step onto someone else's chessboard. Once on that board, one first had to serve as a piece long enough to prove one's worth. Only after making others comfortable enough to use you would there be a chance to climb upward. But even if one succeeded in climbing, one could still be pushed out and used as a sacrifice at any moment. And with only grade C aptitude, the clan had even less reason to invest heavily in him. So the best road was still to develop alone. To grow silently, accumulate silently, not stand out too early, not make others feel threatened too quickly. And at just that moment, the inheritance of the flower wine traveler had appeared. It was like an escape route opening at the perfect moment. A source of resources hidden in the dark. Enough to let him continue growing stronger without having to openly join any faction. Enough to let him avoid most of the clan's internal struggles. And also enough to maintain the image he had so painstakingly built before the mountain village's upper ranks. But even though he now had a retreat, there was still another matter he could not avoid: primeval stones. Fang Yuan began calculating very quickly. Previously, with only Moonlight Gu and Liquor Worm to feed, he was already spending nearly 1 primeval stone per day. Now, with the addition of Little Light Gu, and then White Boar Gu on top of that, the daily cost of feeding his Gu worms alone had already exceeded 2 primeval stones. If cultivation expenses and living costs were added in, then at minimum he had to spend 5 primeval stones per day. 5 stones a day was by no means a small number. Even though he currently had several hundred primeval stones in hand, he still could not sustain this kind of expenditure forever. And the higher a Gu master cultivated, the more resources he would consume. Especially once he reached rank 2, where each refinement and fusion of Gu worms would become an enormous expense. And besides primeval stones, White Boar Gu also brought along another kind of trouble. Its food was pork. Not just a little, either every 5 days, it had to eat an entire full-grown pig. On King Mao Mountain, that was no small matter. Ordinary mortals would only dare slaughter a pig for meat on special occasions. The mountainous terrain was also unsuitable for large-scale livestock raising. If one wanted pork, then most of the time one still had to rely on hunters going into the mountains to kill wild boars. If Fang Yuan kept regularly buying large amounts of pork within the mountain village, sooner or later others would notice. A youth eating that much meat who would not grow suspicious. So very quickly he made his decision: he would hunt by himself. That way, he could solve the food problem for White Boar Gu, reduce the pressure on his primeval stones, and also avoid easily drawing suspicion from others. Thinking this, he did not hesitate any further. Fang Yuan called for the waiter to settle the bill, stood up, and left the inn. These past few days, the academy was on break so that the students could focus on refining their second Gu worm. For others, this was a period of rest and adjustment, but for Fang Yuan, it was instead a perfectly timed opportunity to leave the mountain village, scout the terrain, and begin hunting boars in the mountains. By day, the mountain forest looked peaceful enough. Sunlight filtered through the canopy. Green grass covered the ground beneath his feet. And in the distance, there were birdsong and the soft sound of running water. But Fang Yuan did not relax in the slightest, because he knew very well that the farther he moved from the mountain village, the more dangerous it became. This place held not only wild beasts, but also poisonous insects, traps, and even sudden disasters that could take a person's life at any moment. With his current strength, he did not dare go too deep. The goal of this trip was only to hunt wild boars along the outer mountain, where the clan regularly swept through all year round. But even so, finding prey was not easy at all. Without a scouting Gu worm, and still unfamiliar with the terrain, Fang Yuan could only rely on experience and follow traces one by one. He walked for a long time and searched very carefully, yet still found nothing. At that point, he immediately changed direction. If the mountainside was hard to search, then he would go down to the foot of the mountain. At the foot of King Mao Mountain were scattered mortal villages, all under the control of the three great mountain strongholds. The mortals living there were protected, controlled, and also cut off from the path of becoming Gu masters. The clans would rather recruit servants from these villagers than easily allow outsiders to grasp power. Because in this world, whoever held power was the one who lived. And in the end, power only felt secure when it remained in the hands of one's own bloodline. After half a watch of descending the mountain, Fang Yuan finally saw cooking smoke and a small village nestled by the river. And at exactly that moment, he discovered what he needed: wild boar tracks. With only a glance, he recognized them at once. Without hesitating, Fang Yuan immediately followed the trail deeper into the forest. During the pursuit, he came across quite a few other things. A herd of wild deer were grazing. The moment they sensed movement, they sprang away and fled. If it had been someone else, perhaps he would have been tempted. Deer hide, venison, and antlers all had value. But Fang Yuan only glanced at them and moved on. His goal today was very clear: wild boars. Only wild boars could solve the feeding needs of White Boar Gu. After going a bit farther, he saw a beehive hanging from a tree trunk. The honey inside also had value and could even serve as food for certain Gu worms. But Fang Yuan still did not touch it. Because he knew clearly that with his current strength, not everything profitable could be taken. A little greed was all it would take, and the price might very well be his own life. The farther he went, the clearer the wild boar traces became. That also meant the prey was already very close. Fang Yuan became more and more cautious. Because he knew that a wild boar was not a domestic pig. If a full-grown wild boar went mad, even a tiger might not dare risk its life against it. And in this world, even wild beasts were anything but simple. At last, he found his target. But the sight before him made him pause slightly. That wild boar was not running through the forest at all. It had already fallen into a pit trap. The bottom of the pit was lined with sharpened bamboo spears. Its whole body had been pierced through, blood pouring everywhere, but it was still thrashing wildly. This was clearly a hunter's trap. In other words, Fang Yuan had accidentally picked up a bargain. But he did not feel completely pleased. Because the moment he looked at that trap, he immediately realized something even more worrying. If the one who had fallen down there had not been a wild boar, but him, then with his current strength, he probably would not have lasted even half a quarter of an hour. The forest near the village was safer than the deep mountains, but it was full of traps set by hunters. Some could be seen, but some were hidden extremely well. One careless mistake was enough to lose one's life. From that moment on, a different idea arose in Fang Yuan's mind. If he wanted to hunt in this region, then aimless searching was not enough. He needed someone familiar with the terrain, someone who knew where the traps were and where the beasts usually moved. In other words, he needed to pry information out of a seasoned hunter. Having decided, he wasted no more time. With a slight movement of his wrist, a moonblade flew out at once. A cold light flashed past and cut straight into the wild boar's neck. Blood sprayed like a fountain, dyeing the entire bottom of the pit red. The beast thrashed madly, let out a few final howls, and then its struggles slowly weakened until it became completely still. Fang Yuan stood at the edge of the pit, calmly watching it all. Survival or death to him, this was only the most ordinary law of nature. The living ate, the weak died. There was nothing surprising in that. But just then, voices suddenly came from the distance. At first, they were only a few broken lines of conversation. Then very quickly the sounds grew clearer and clearer. A group of young hunters was approaching, flattering the man leading them as they walked. They talked about hunting skill, about wild boars, even about marriages in the village. And the man at the front clearly was not someone easy to provoke. He was tall and strongly built, with a bow on his back and sharp eyes. The moment he stepped out of the woods, he saw Fang Yuan standing beside the trap pit. In an instant, his face darkened and he barked directly, "HMPH, whose child are you from the village, daring to snatch what belongs to me, Wangerer? Hurry up and get lost. When he heard Wang yell at him to get lost, Fang Yuan gave no reply. He only let out a cold laugh and immediately attacked. A dark green moonblade tore through the air. And at the same time, he kicked off the ground and took the initiative to close in on the hunters before him. The moment they saw the moonblade appear, they instantly understood that the person standing before them was not an ordinary youth, but a real Gu master. In the blink of an eye, their formation collapsed. One of them was too slow to dodge, was swept by the moonblade and fell screaming to the ground. The other two were so terrified that they dropped to their knees and begged for mercy without stopping. Only Wang still stood firm. He truly was the leader of this group of hunters. Not only was he bolder than the others, but his reactions were also very fast. Seeing the moonblade flying toward him, he immediately dodged to the side and at the same time drew his bow and shot back. The arrow came extremely fast, forcing Fang Yuan to lower his body to evade, but he did not stop. He kept charging forward because he understood very clearly one thing. If he allowed Wang to keep his distance, he himself would be the one at a disadvantage. Seeing Fang Yuan close in, Wang was also extremely decisive. He abandoned his bow and switched to close combat on the spot. With his large frame and strength far beyond that of ordinary people, his punches were extremely heavy and his momentum fierce. If Fang Yuan were hit head-on, then with his current body, the consequences would certainly not be light. But Fang Yuan did not meet him head-on. At the very instant the two sides were about to collide, he abruptly shifted direction. It was only a very short step, but just enough to slip aside from the attack. At the same time, he used that turning angle to place Wang with his back to the light, then suddenly counterattacked. The sunlight shone straight into Wang eyes, causing him to falter for only an instant. But that was already enough for Fang Yuan to launch the deciding blow. The third moonblade flew out. The distance was now too close. Though Wang reacted very quickly, he only managed to tilt his head enough to partially evade it. The outcome of the clash stopped right there. The strongest person in the hunting group still fell before Fang Yuan in the end. At that moment, the two hunters kneeling nearby were almost numb with shock. Only a moment earlier, they had still been following Wang talking about hunting and laughing with one another as on any ordinary day. Yet in only the blink of an eye, their leader was gone. The difference between mortals and a Gu master at that moment was laid out with terrifying clarity, making neither of them dare move at all. As for Fang Yuan, he also fell to the ground after that evasive turn. But the price had been worth it. He quickly got back up. His shoulder hurt slightly from the impact, but he was not badly injured. Compared with taking one full punch from Wang this result was already extremely good. Standing before the other man's corpse, Fang Yuan also saw clearly what this man's true strength had been. Wang was no ordinary opponent. His archery was very good, his attacks stable and precise. His fists and feet were also strong. Both his speed and explosiveness far exceeded an ordinary person's. If some other student at this stage had encountered him, it was very likely the Gu master side would have suffered instead. Even a rank 1 upper stage Gu master, if careless, might not have won easily. But unfortunately, the person Wang had encountered was Fang Yuan. From the very moment he saw the bow on the other man's back, Fang Yuan had already fixed his fighting method clearly in mind. He had not chosen to stand at range and exchange attacks, because the bow's range was obviously greater than that of the moonblade. Nor had he truly wanted to rush in and exchange blows. Because his current body was still that of a youth and it would be difficult to endure a direct hit, so from beginning to end. All he did was force the distance closed. Force the other side to abandon the bow. And then find a tiny opening to end the battle in the way most favorable to himself. He even felt a little regret afterwards, because that strike had originally been aimed even more precisely than that. It was only because Wang reaction had been too fast. And in that critical instant, he still managed to evade most of it. That the moonblade did not travel along the path Fang Yuan had wanted. That point alone was enough to show that this man truly had not been easy to deal with. After everything, Fang Yuan only quietly looked down at the corpse one final time and thought to himself, "Life and death, survival and destruction are the laws of nature. All things are equal. All things have the right to live, and all things can also be killed. While alive, one may be divided into noble and lowly, but before death, is there any difference between a dead man and a dead pig? Both are just dead. At the foot of King Mao Mountains, in the midst of a thick green forest, there was a wooden house standing quietly among a vegetable garden and a bamboo fence. That morning had originally been very peaceful. Beside the well, a young girl was struggling to draw up a bucket of water. She was dressed simply, but her face was bright and full of life. Her old father came out from the house, half scolding her affectionately for not calling him, then casually lifted the heavy bucket himself. One watered the vegetables, one drew water. In the small house nestled among the mountains, the warmth of family spread very naturally. Old man Wang laughed as he worked. He mentioned his second son, saying that his hunting skill was now very good, even better than his own had been when he was young. It was only that the boy was too competitive, too eager to charge ahead. Then he joked about marrying off his daughter, saying he hoped to hold a grandchild one day and live out the rest of his years in peace. That scene should have lasted a little longer. But right then the gate in the fence was kicked open. Fang Yuan stepped in. His expression was cold, and in his hand glimmered the faint blue light of moonlight. The moment Wang the old man saw that glow, he immediately understood that the person before him was a Gu master and hurriedly dropped to his knees in salute. Then Fang Yuan spoke directly. His son Wang had died because of conflict with him. Right after that, the two young hunters carried the corpse in from outside. The moment he saw his son's body, old man Wang's whole body trembled violently. And the young girl nearly burst into tears on the spot, rushing forward to clutch her brother's corpse as her cries rang out through the little courtyard that only moments ago had still been peaceful. But Fang Yuan had not come only to deliver the news. He stated his purpose clearly. He needed a map of the surrounding mountains. On it had to be marked all the hunting traps in the area, along with the paths, habits, and activity range of the wild beasts that old man Wang had accumulated through years of hunting. His words were not long, but the meaning was very clear. If old man Wang cooperated, then the matter could end there. If not, then it would be very difficult for the Wang family to remain at peace. Because under the rule of the mountain village, the people of the mortal villages already stood one level lower than Gu masters. Once they were accused of offending their betters, it was hardly uncommon for the matter to spread to clan punishment as well. The moment she heard that, the girl reacted at once. She was in pain and furious, almost unable to hold herself back as she charged straight at Fang Yuan. But before she had taken more than a few steps, the one who stopped her was none other than her own father. Old man Wang shouted angrily and slapped his daughter to the ground. That slap was not only to stop her, but also the desperation of a father who had just lost one son, yet was still forced to make sure that the people who remained alive could go on living. With a choking voice, he asked his daughter whether she wanted to die too, whether she wanted this old father of hers to truly have nothing left at all. Hearing those words, the girl finally broke into sobs. In that crying there was pain, grievance, hatred, but above all helplessness. After that, old man Wang turned back around and knelt fully before Fang Yuan. He bowed his head very low, his voice shaking word by word. He admitted that his son had offended someone he should never have offended. He also agreed to draw the map, asking only that Fang Yuan spare the others in the family. At that point, Fang Yuan's attitude softened slightly. He made it clear that as long as old man Wang drew it truthfully, he would not make things harder. But if there were any falsehoods in it, then the consequences were something the man himself ought to understand. Old man Wang repeatedly kowtowed, not daring to resist with a single word. When he asked to go inside and fetch paper and brush, Fang Yuan refused. He did not allow the people in the house freedom to move about. Instead, he ordered the two young hunters to go in and search for the paper and brush, then bring them out. Even that small detail showed that he maintained tight vigilance at all times, not allowing any unexpected development to occur. The paper they brought out was a special southern bamboo paper, durable and resistant to dampness. Old man Wang knelt right there on the ground, brush in hand, drawing line after line. Mountain roads, hunting traps, places beasts often passed through, all of it was recorded one after another. One sheet, then two, then more than 10 bamboo paper sheets gradually filled with black ink strokes. When he finished, he raised the whole set of maps with both hands and offered them to Fang Yuan. But Fang Yuan still did not fully trust him. He looked through them briefly, then split the papers into two halves and handed them to the two young hunters who had come with Wang Er. After that, he said very simply, whoever pointed out an error would be rewarded one primeval stone for each mistake found. The two young hunters took the bamboo sheets with trembling hands. The more they read, the more astonished they became. Because what was written, there was no longer a few scattered notes. It was almost the entirety of the hunting knowledge the Wang family had accumulated over generations. Where there were deer, where there were bears, where traps had once been set, which paths were safe, which paths ought not be taken. To a hunter, such things were one's means of survival. And the one who held all that experience was Old Man Wang, the most seasoned hunter in this area. The two of them flipped back and forth through the sheets for a long time. Only after being urged did they reluctantly hand them back. Then both confirmed that nothing written there was wrong. Old Man Wang also hurriedly kowtowed and repeatedly said he absolutely would not dare deceive him. Hearing that, Fang Yuan only gave a slight nod. But immediately after that, he said one sentence coldly, "But I do not believe you." The moment those words fell, everything happened too quickly. Before Old Man Wang could even react, a moonblade had already flown out. The sudden change was so abrupt that everyone around them froze. Cries of alarm, hurried footsteps. The entire little courtyard, which had already been heavy with grief, was thrown into even greater chaos in an instant. The two young hunters were so frightened they could barely stand. The girl also lunged forward in despair. But faced with the situation, Fang Yuan did not allow things to continue slipping out of his control. He acted with complete decisiveness. For him at that moment, the most important thing was not what feelings he left in others, but eliminating the danger that might emerge later. If you cut the grass and do not pull out the roots, the spring wind will bring it back green. After that, he turned his gaze toward the two remaining hunters. He told them to get up and search the house. Because he knew that what truly mattered to a hunter was not the temporary bamboo paper sheets just drawn, but the hide map passed down through generations. Only that one would fully record the terrain, the traps, the tracks, and the beast's range of movement. If he wanted to hunt in the mountains over the long term, that was what he truly needed. The two young men no longer dared delay. They hurried wildly into the house and turned everything upside down. The sounds of furniture falling, bowls and cups clattering, and frantic footsteps rang out without pause. But no matter how they searched, they still could not find it. The longer they failed to find it, the more terrified they became. Because everyone understood that if they still could not bring out what Fang Yuan wanted, then their own ends would also be far from peaceful. After a while, Fang Yuan himself stepped into the wooden house. He ignored the pleas of the two young hunters and only slowly looked around. 4 bedrooms, 1 sitting room, 1 kitchen. Everything had already been overturned, but there was still no map. That only made him more certain. Because earlier, when he had deliberately let the two of them go inside to fetch paper and brush, Old Man Wang's reaction had been very strange. He had answered too quickly, too urgently, as if afraid that someone would use that chance to find something they were not supposed to see. Thinking this, Fang Yuan's gaze settled on the fireplace in the sitting room. A place very easy to overlook. He stepped over, crouched down, picked up the iron tongs at the side, and began shifting the charcoal piece by piece. Most of it was ordinary charcoal, light and brittle. But very quickly he found one piece that was different. It was heavier, harder. Not like burnt firewood at all. Fang Yuan used the tongs to lift it out and toss it to the ground. The black outer shell shattered apart, revealing inside a bamboo tube hidden with great care. At that point, even the two hunters standing nearby could not help staring blankly. Fang Yuan opened the bamboo tube and took out from inside a large rolled beast hide map. The moment he spread it open, a detailed terrain map appeared before his eyes. Compared with the bamboo paper sheets from before, this was the thing that truly had value. It was much broader, recorded a far larger area, and the markings were also far more complete. On it were not only mountains, streams, and trails, but also the zones where different herds of beasts moved. Fang Yuan swept his eyes over it and very quickly noticed something unusual. The beast-hide map had marked out the areas where wild boars were distributed. Among them, near the edge of the map, there was a special symbol that had not appeared at all on the bamboo paper sheets from before. That one detail alone was enough to prove it. Old Man Wang had indeed concealed an important part. It was not that the young hunters had intentionally deceived Fang Yuan. Their understanding simply had not been deep enough, so even after reading the bamboo paper sheets they had not recognized what was missing. Only now did everything truly become clear. From the very start, Fang Yuan had never intended to take a few sheets of notes and trust them immediately. What he needed was a map that could actually be used. Something sufficient to let him hunt with peace of mind, avoid traps, find the proper targets, and keep himself from falling into a passive position in the mountains. So from the moment he had stood beside the trap pit and overheard the hunters talking, he had already begun setting his sights on this map. After that, everything that happened later had in fact revolved around that single purpose. For Fang Yuan, striking was never about impulse. Nor was it because of some insulting sentence alone. What he looked toward from beginning to end was the result. If one method could solve the problem faster, more cleanly, and with fewer future dangers, then he would choose that method. And in this situation, what he needed most was a real map. And now at last it lay in his hands. At this point, Fang Yuan had already put the beast-hide map back into the bamboo tube, tied it tightly, and slung it over his back. The two hunters kneeling on the ground stared fixedly at that tube, unable to hide the regret in their eyes. Because they understood very clearly that what lay inside it was no ordinary object. To a Gu master, it might only be a map. But to hunters who lived by relying on the mountains and forests, it was almost the most precious possession of the entire Wang family. Fang Yuan saw that clearly as well. But he did not speak of the map immediately. Instead, in a cold voice, he asked a different question, whether there was anyone else left in the Wang family. The moment the two men heard that, they were startled and immediately shook their heads over and over. In a panic, they hurriedly told him everything about old man Wang's household. The wife had died long ago, the eldest son was also dead, the daughter-in-law was gone afterward as well, and by now there truly was no one else left. By the time they said this, both were trembling with fear. Because they knew very well that the answer to this question was directly tied to whether they lived or died. One of them even tried adding more, doing his best to speak ill of old man Wang, saying he was difficult by nature, that he had once caused dissatisfaction among the people in the village. The other joined in as well, partly to curry favor, partly to prove that he had no intention of hiding anything at all. Fang Yuan stood there and listened to all of it without interrupting. He understood very clearly that these words were not entirely sincere. Most of it was simply panic driving them to try to save their own lives. But hidden within those embellishments, he could still hear a trace of their genuine resentment toward old man Wang. As for such things to him now, they were no longer important anyway. Then Fang Yuan spoke plainly. He did not circle around the point, nor did he pretend to be kind. This time he had indeed come here because he wanted this beast-hide map. The way those two had behaved he considered acceptable. And since that was the case, they could leave. Hearing that, the two hunters almost could not believe their own ears. They immediately kowtowed again and again, thanking him without pause, then hurriedly turned as if to flee from the place at once. But at exactly that moment, a voice suddenly rang out from the treetop behind them. "Stop." Right after that, a figure leapt down lightly. It was a Gu master dressed in dark green, tall and thin, with the number 2 inlaid on his belt, clearly a rank 2 Gu master. He wore gloves over his wrists and guards bound to his shins. At a glance, one could tell he was someone extremely agile in movement. The moment the two hunters saw him, they immediately collapsed flat onto the ground. Because they recognized him at once. This was Xianxia, the Gu master stationed in the village. He did not hurry to pay attention to the two mortals trembling on the ground. His gaze first stopped on Fang Yuan and asked who he was. Fang Yuan did not answer at length. He merely opened his hand slightly, revealing the glow of moonlight Gu in his palm. That one motion alone caused Xiangxia's attitude to soften immediately. Moonlight Gu was a very clear sign of someone from the Gu Yu clan and could not be faked. Only then did Fang Yuan briefly explain the entire matter. He admitted right away that old man Wang's second son had offended him, and that was why he had struck. The two remaining hunters could testify to that. And those two, not daring to hesitate, immediately nodded to confirm it. The surprising thing was that after hearing everything, Jiang He did not grow angry. On the contrary, he laughed loudly and said that if mortals dared offend a Gu master, then they indeed deserved punishment. It was only that immediately afterward his tone changed. He said that since the matter had happened within the area under his own watch, if the village population decreased, then at year's end when the clan made its assessment, his own evaluation would very likely be affected as well. By that point, Jiang He's meaning had become quite clear. On the surface, he was speaking of rules, but underneath, he was clearly using the matter to probe Fang Yuan's reaction, and even seemed to want to pressure him into giving some kind of concession. After hearing this, Fang Yuan only smiled faintly. He answered very simply, if that was the case, then senior brother could just report the truth. He could simply say that the man had been killed by Fang Yuan, and that the matter had nothing to do with Jiang He. That answer made Jiang He pause for a moment. Because if he truly reported it that way, the matter might not necessarily explode into something huge. But his own year-end evaluation would indeed be difficult to keep looking good. So he immediately changed how he spoke. His tone became more formal and severe. And he told Fang Yuan to clearly state his name, saying that he would record the matter according to the rules and submit it properly. It sounded fair, but in truth it was still only another test. If it had been another youth, perhaps such a tone would already have shaken him. But unfortunately, the person standing in front of him was Fang Yuan. Not only did Fang Yuan fail to retreat, he calmly gave his name at once, Gu Yu Fang Yuan. Only then did Jiang He's expression truly change. He immediately recognized the name. Recently in the mountain stronghold, there had been no shortage of talk about Fang Yuan. Beating up classmates, extorting primeval stones, opening good Gu worms from stones one after another, and even possessing a liquor worm. Even Jiang He's younger brother Xianxia had mentioned him quite a few times. And once Jiang He knew exactly who stood before him, his attitude changed completely. He laughed, began speaking in a much more familiar manner, and even mentioned that his younger brother had once done business with Fang Yuan. After exchanging a few words, he took the initiative to lower his voice and said that since they were acquaintances, this matter could be dropped and he would simply shoulder it as though nothing had happened. To put it bluntly, Jiang He also had no desire to report the matter upward for real. Because to him, the lives of a few mortals in the village were not worth making a fuss over. If he reported the matter honestly, he himself would be implicated first. But if he covered it up and changed the story to being attacked by wild beasts or some accident, then both he and Fang Yuan would be spared a great deal of trouble. Doing a small favor in passing was far more beneficial. Before letting Fang Yuan leave, Jiang He even added one sentence full of implication. He remarked that if Fang Yuan had gone out wearing his proper Gu master attire and displaying his identity more clearly, then Wang likely would not have dared offend him from the very beginning. On the surface, it sounded like only a piece of advice, but in truth it was also a very clear reminder. In the future, do not casually run into the area under Jiang He's control and cause more trouble. Fang Yuan understood the meaning immediately. He did not argue. He only cupped his hands in thanks, then left cleanly and decisively. The night in the mountains was bright. The moon hung high, silver light spreading across the forest. Amid the summer wind and the endless hum of insects, Fang Yuan quietly moved through the grass, slowly drawing close to a wild boar that had lowered its head and was rooting in the ground for food. But the beasts of the mountains were extremely sensitive. Though he had tried his utmost to remain silent, the wild boar still quickly sensed that something was wrong. It jerked its head up, ears pricked straight, then turned around and let out a low growl full of alertness. Fang Yuan was not surprised. He knew very well that with his current set of Gu worms, he still lacked methods specifically meant for concealing his breath or muffling his footsteps. If he had breath-hiding Gu and silent step Gu as well, approaching prey would have been much easier. But raising more Gu meant the cost would increase sharply, beyond what he could currently bear. And for that reason, ordinary Gu masters rarely acted alone. More often, they moved in teams to make up for one another's weaknesses. But Fang Yuan had no such choice. He continued advancing all the same. And the wild boar too had already been pushed to its limit. It scraped the ground hard several times with its front hooves. Then suddenly charged straight at him. Its two sharp white tusks looking especially dangerous under the moonlight. If he were struck head-on, the consequences would certainly be severe. So at that very instant, Fang Yuan immediately activated Moonlight Gu. A dark green light gathered in his right hand. One moonblade shot out, slicing through the air and slashing straight across the wild boar's head, sending fresh blood spraying. But that strike was still not enough to kill it. The pain only made the beast more ferocious, and its speed as it charged grew even faster. At that moment, Fang Yuan twisted his body and rolled aside, barely avoiding the frontal crash. The boar lost its balance and slammed heavily into a small tree behind him, snapping the trunk apart. The instant he got back up, Fang Yuan counterattacked at once. His right hand swung repeatedly, sending moonblade after moonblade flying out. They slashed across the wild boar's body, leaving one long wound after another on its thick gray hide. Blood poured out more and more, but only at this point did the beast's toughness truly become obvious. A moonblade could break bone, and yet on the body of this boar, it still only managed to carve deep wounds into the outer flesh. The wild boar charged at him several more times. And each time, Fang Yuan used exactly the same method of handling it. Dodge at the last possible moment, then take the chance to launch moonblades the instant it had rushed past. That style of fighting looked simple, but it was extremely rational. Because although wild boars were powerful and their charge was brutal, their weakness lay in their poor ability to change direction. As long as one stayed calm enough and precise enough, it was entirely possible to wear them down little by using the force of their own momentum against them. After several rounds like that, the beast's movements had already started to slow. Even its growls were no longer as forceful as they had been at first. Only then did Fang Yuan use his next card. He activated both Moonlight Gu and Little Light Gu at the same time. A pale white glow merged into the dark green light, making the moonblade about to be released much larger than before. And its power also clearly rose. Then he struck. The strengthened moonblade cut straight into the boar's neck, sinking deep into flesh, then flew several more meters before finally dispersing. The beast stood rigid for an instant. Then blood burst out like a spring, and its heavy body crashed to the ground. Only now did the hunt truly end. Fang Yuan did not linger. He immediately called out White Boar Gu and let it burrow into the boar's corpse. A while later, White Boar Gu flew back out again, while the boar's carcass had become visibly gaunter. Most of the flesh had already been completely absorbed by it, leaving behind only skin, bones, and internal organs. Thanks to this, the White Boar Gu's feeding needs were temporarily solved for another few days. Fang Yuan kept only the two boar tusks. Even though the meat was almost completely worthless by now, and the hide had already been cut and torn badly in many places, the tusks could still be used as materials or exchanged later. Only after that did he hide those scant spoils in the secret cave within the rock crevice and return to the academy dormitory. But returning did not mean resting. The moment he entered his room, he sat cross-legged on the bed and began cultivating as usual. Inside his aperture, the primeval sea rippled, and the dark green primeval essence of upper stage circulated slowly. After the hunt, not much primeval essence remained. Just killing one ordinary wild boar had already consumed nearly 20% of his upper stage primeval essence. Enough to show that with his current rank 1 cultivation, every trip down the mountain was by no means light work. Then he activated White Boar Gu again. A faint white light spread from this Gu throughout his whole body, beginning to quietly transform every inch of skin, every bit of muscle. At first it was only a strange, numb sensation. But very quickly it turned into stabbing pain, then into agony as though each strand of flesh were being torn apart. Fang Yuan immediately stopped. He knew very clearly that no matter how good a Gu worm was, it still had its limits. White Boar Gu could gradually strengthen the body, but if he forced it too much, the pain would only become more violent, and might even turn dangerous. So what mattered was not being impatient, but knowing when to stop at the proper point. Time passed just like that, and before long it was already mid-June. The summer nights on King Mao Mountain were still bright under the moon. The cries of cicadas, frogs, and wind moving through the leaves blended together, and from time to time there came the distant howl of a wolf. By the riverbank, water flowed over smooth white stones. And there, Fang Yuan was once again facing a wild boar that had been driven into its final corner. The beast was covered in wounds, blood running down its body, but it still tried to charge him once more. A wild beast, when already gravely injured like that, was often the most troublesome kind of opponent. One small mistake was enough for it to turn the tables and strike back viciously. But Fang Yuan remained calm throughout. As he fought, he also kept a close eye on the movement around him. The previous hunts had already given him enough experience. The smell of blood in the mountains very easily attracted other trouble. Sometimes it was more boars, sometimes wolves. At one point, it had nearly even drawn a tiger. Gradually, the boar's momentum began to weaken. At exactly that moment, Fang Yuan suddenly closed the distance. He lowered his body, pinned it with his shoulder, then used all his strength to heave the beast completely off the ground. In the next instant, he twisted and hurled it hard against a huge rock by the riverbank. A heavy crash rang out. The boar hit the ground, twitched a few more times, and then finally lay still. The stream beside them continued flowing, carrying away the diluted streaks of red blood downstream. Fang Yuan stood there, breathing hard, but in his eyes there was already a trace of satisfaction. Because what he cared about was not only having killed this prey. More importantly, after so many continuous days of using White Boar Gu to nourish his body, his strength had risen visibly. Compared with before, when he could only stand at range and use moonblades to wear his prey down, now he could directly lift an entire wild boar. That was a very great change. Naturally, he also understood very clearly that this did not mean he was already strong enough to meet a boar head-on. Being able to lift one and truly wrestling it directly were two different things. But no matter what, it was still a clear step forward. And because of that, his mind immediately turned toward the giant boulder at the end of the tunnel. Perhaps tonight he could try pushing it again, after dealing with the prey. He let White Boar Gu eat all the flesh it required, took the 2 boar tusks, then casually shredded the hide, which had already been badly damaged anyway. As for the rest, he did not concern himself too much. On summer nights in the mountains, once the smell of blood spread, sooner or later another beast would arrive to clean up what remained. And even if someone else later discovered the traces, he had already handled them enough that it would not be easy to recognize moonblade wounds. When he returned to the secret cave, he casually tossed the 2 tusks into a corner. There was already a small pile of wild boar tusks. These were the fruits he had gradually accumulated over this recent stretch of time. After that, Fang Yuan went straight into the tunnel, and once again stood before the boulder blocking the way. He gathered his strength and tried to push. His face flushed red, every limb taut with force, but the boulder did not move in the slightest. This failure did not make him discouraged. On the contrary, it only made him more certain that the inheritance of the flower wine traveler could never be obtained so easily. His strength had increased, but it was still not enough. If he wanted to go farther, he would still have to remain patient, leaving the tunnel. Fang Yuan returned to the hidden chamber above, took out the bamboo tube, and opened the beast hide map and the bamboo sheets stored within. Ever since obtaining this map, he had begun memorizing it piece by piece. Because he did not possess a storage Gu, nor could he keep carrying the map on his person all the time. At this stage, the best thing he could do was simply carve it into his memory. As he looked at it, he used his finger to trace lightly over the ground, helping himself remember the terrain. This method was troublesome, but he understood very well. If one avoided trouble at the start and refused to do something when it needed doing, then later one would only run into even greater trouble. Thinking that, he could not help laughing a little. Youth really did have its advantages. His memory was still very good now. In such a short time, he had already memorized more than half of the map. If it had been him in old age, perhaps he would have forgotten part of it the moment he finished learning it. He even briefly thought of Bookworm Gu. If he had that thing, then he would only have to feed it the map, and from then on he would never have to worry about forgetting again. Unfortunately, Bookworm Gu was a rare Gu almost on the same level as Liquor Worm or White Boar Gu. Obtaining it in the short term was nearly impossible. But Fang Yuan did not dwell on that for long. He adjusted himself again very quickly. Compared with his previous life, after all, his current circumstances were already much better. At this point in that earlier life, he had still only been rank 1 initial stage, left far behind by people like Fang Zheng, Chi Cheng, and Bei. But now he had already managed to keep up with them into middle stage, even though his aptitude was only grade C. Part of that result was due to the Liquor Worm. Part was due to his own cultivation experience. And part of it came from the choices he himself had made. By forcing his classmates to keep practicing fists and footwork, he had invisibly drained away a great deal of their time and energy. Because of that, the cultivation speed of those 3 in this life had to some degree already become slower than in the memories he held from his last life. Even so, that advantage could not be maintained forever. As time passed, the strengths of Fang Zheng, Bei, and Chi Cheng in aptitude and backing were beginning to show more and more clearly. The gap that Fang Yuan had once struggled so hard to preserve was now gradually being erased. On top of that, recently he also had to divide his attention among hunting, feeding White Boar Gu, and probing the inheritance hidden in the secret cave. So in his heart, he had already made a decision long ago. He would not compete for the reward of 30 primeval stones given to the first person to break through to upper stage. It was not that he lacked any chance. If he temporarily set aside White Boar Gu and poured all his strength into cultivation, he could still try to fight for it. But in his eyes, that small bit of profit was not worth the excessive attention it would draw from others. What he needed most right now was still concealment. Only by being noticed less could he continue safely inheriting the Flower Wine Traveler's legacy. That was the truly important objective. Once he thought it through like that, he lowered his head and looked again at the Beast Hide map. This map had 2 sides. The front recorded daytime conditions. The back recorded nighttime conditions. All kinds of lines, symbols, and colors crossed over one another in a dense web. If he had not relied on his own experience combined with those bamboo sheets, it would have been very difficult to fully decipher all the meanings. By now, he already understood the great majority of the markings on it. For instance, the red cross marks he saw in certain areas most likely represented dangerous regions or forbidden zones. One of them lay exactly inside the area where wild boars gathered, which very likely meant there was even a wild boar king hidden there. If that were true, then with his current strength, he absolutely could not go near it. Thinking of that, he remembered Old Man Wang once more. Because on those earlier bamboo sheets, that location had not been recorded at all. If he had trusted only that sparse information and gone charging in, then perhaps only when he encountered the Wild Boar King would he realize he had been pushed into danger. Even before death, that old man had still left behind another layer of calculation. And that only made Fang Yuan even more cautious with every piece of information in his hands. Only one final point still remained unexplained. That was the 3 red circles, marked in 3 places quite far apart from one another on the map. Around those 3 locations there did not seem to be many beasts, nor did they look especially dangerous at a glance. Yet Old Man Wang had still used red to mark them separately, proving that in his eyes, those 3 spots must have held some very special meaning. Fang Yuan sat silently with his gaze fixed on the map, deep in thought. If the red crosses represented danger, then what exactly were these 3 red circles? Something valuable, a hidden path, or some kind of sign that at present he still could not understand. That was the last unresolved, not remaining in this Beast Hide map. And unfortunately, all 3 places were too far away from where he stood. Otherwise, he would likely already have gone and checked them out for himself long ago. At the end of June, the Academy finally entered the mid-year examination period. In the oppressive summer heat, the Academy elder stood on the platform and called the students up one by one to receive their stipends. And the first name spoken was Fang Zheng. Under the envious gaze of the students around him, he stepped forward and received the heavy pouch of primeval stones from the Academy elder's hand. Because this time he was the first person to break through to rank 1 upper stage. There was no doubt this was his first true victory before the eyes of everyone. Sitting below, Fang Zheng clenched the pouch tightly in his hand, feeling both stirred and excited within. Because to others this was only one instance of taking the lead. But to him, it was also the first crack in the great shadow that Fang Yuan had cast over him for so long. At last he had once surpassed his elder brother, and what about Fang Yuan? He was still slumped over the desk sleeping as always. Not pretending, but genuinely so exhausted he could not stay upright. The night before he had hunted wild boars, fed White Boar Gu, absorbed primeval essence from primeval stones, refined it with the liquor worms, and finally nourished his aperture until nearly dawn. By the time he came to class, he had only managed to eat something carelessly before collapsing face down onto the desk to sleep. Yet it was precisely that image which caused an entirely different feeling to arise in Fang Zheng's heart. This time, whether Fang Yuan was truly sleeping or simply did not want to acknowledge things, the result still did not change. He had won. And as long as he could win once, then there would be a second time and then a third. Elsewhere, Mo Bei sat with his arms folded, his expression not looking good at all. Chi Cheng's face had darkened as well. The two of them both understood very clearly that ever since cultivation had begun, the so-called advantage of grade, aptitude had become more and more visible. No matter how hard one worked, no matter how much help one's elders gave from behind, that gap still existed. In Chi Cheng's heart, there was even a trace of irritation. Because it seemed to him that the Fang brothers had somehow taken all the best things for themselves. The younger brother had grade A aptitude. The elder brother, though only grade C, possessed a liquor worm. The more he thought about it, the clearer the unwillingness inside him became. The whole academy also began whispering. Some sighed that Fang Zheng truly lived up to grade A aptitude. Some felt regret for Mo Bei and Chi Cheng. There were also those who turned to look at Fang Yuan, envying the liquor worm he possessed, while at the same time feeling that without that Gu, he probably would not be anything especially remarkable at all. But then the academy elder slammed the table once. The whole academy immediately fell silent. And only then was the truly important announcement made. The mid-year examination for this class would begin in 3 days. The content of the test would be hunting wild boars. The more tusks one brought back, the higher one's result. For each tusk, the academy would exchange 10 primeval stones. In addition, students would be permitted to act in teams. The moment that news ended, the entire academy nearly exploded at once. Some were excited, some were worried. Others had already begun thinking about how to form teams and coordinate with one another to make up for their weaknesses in aptitude and Gu worms. Because not everyone possessed Moonlight Gu for battle, and even fewer could truly face wild boars alone outside the mountains. But when Fang Yuan heard this, his expression changed very slightly. Because he remembered very clearly that in his previous life, the mid-year examination for this class had not been hunting wild boars. Back then, the content had been gathering wild honey. And now, everything was different. That one change alone was enough to make him understand something extremely clearly. From the moment he was reborn until now, he had already changed far too many things. Killing Gu Jinsheng, digging out the flower wine traveler's inheritance, forcing his way into the forefront among the students instead of being left behind as in his past life. All of those things were now causing the gears of fate to drift little by little away from their original track. The mid-year examination changing was only the first clear sign of it showing itself. At that moment, a trace of urgency also rose faintly in Fang Yuan's heart. Because his greatest advantage had always rested in the memories of his previous life. But if the future now began changing more and more, then that advantage would also gradually disappear. That feeling, however, did not last long. Very quickly, he adjusted himself again. Because he understood very clearly that if change could no longer be prevented, then the only thing left to do was to become stronger even faster. Whether the road ahead was the old one or a completely different one, he had no intention of stopping. If the world truly was beginning to turn in a new direction, then he would simply keep walking forward himself and carve out the road as he went. And then his thoughts quickly turned back to something more practical. This examination was wild boar hunting. Each tusk could be exchanged for 10 primeval stones. And in his hidden cave, he already had not a few boar tusks accumulated from before. As long as he brought that pile out, he could absolutely exchange it for a considerable sum. But the moment that thought appeared, he immediately weighed it more carefully. If he brought that pile of tusks out, then of course he could exchange it for primeval stones. But what he would receive would not be money alone. He would also receive the gaze of others, suspicion, and attention he did not need. And in his current circumstances, what he needed most was still concealment. Yet when he reached that thought, another direction also arose in his mind. Perhaps this examination was not only about primeval stones. It could also be an opportunity for him to adjust the image the clan's upper ranks had of him. Because from the very beginning, what impression had they held of him? A youth of grade C aptitude, cold, rational, difficult to handle, and carrying a clear sense of dissatisfaction toward the clan. That image had once helped him protect himself through the crises immediately before him. But if he kept it unchanged, then the farther things went, the more disadvantageous it would become. Because any organization required loyalty. And once someone was labeled as disloyal, then it became very difficult for others to feel secure leaving him around for long. So he needed to change. Not to change completely, and not to truly step into the clan's system, but to make the upper ranks feel that he had softened a little. That he knew how to bow his head at the proper time. That he looked at least somewhat more willing than before to merge into the clan's course. As long as he could achieve even that much, then he would have more room to continue acting independently outside it. And this mid-year examination was exactly a very suitable opportunity. At that thought, Fang Yuan's eyes brightened slightly. Another plan had already begun forming in his mind. Not hurried, not blatant, but enough to let him gradually turn the situation in a direction more favorable to himself. And the first step of that plan would begin with extortion.